Balayerev a rinne úsle, and you're very welcome to this Lá Féile Bride. So it's Saint Brigid's Day, and she is Aspel Mór na Héireann. She is one of the primary saints of Ireland. So she's the female high saint, and Saint Patrick, of course, as we know, is the male high saint. So I have been having a wonderful time talking to all of the elder population in Cork City and in Kerry and all around the place, and they've been telling me their memories and their reminiscences of Saint Brigid and the traditions that they would have carried forward. Saint Brigid was a great weaver of stories herself, and there are so many red threads of story about our great saint. And tonight, for you, I'm going to try and weave some of those threads together. So, Saint Brigid was born Brigid, and she was born into a family in County Louth. Her father was a chieftain, so she was born into comfort. But it was in a time when women had no power. Even women who were born into comfortable homes had to do as they were bid, as Bridget was to find out down the road. She was very fond of the new religion, and she felt in her heart that she belonged to God himself and that she was here to do his work. It was said of Bridget that she was always happy, that she was always singing a song in the corner while she was doing her work. And it was said of her two hands that she could hold nothing in them. As soon as someone gave something to little Bridget, she made sure that it found a new home with somebody who needed it. Her pantry was completely famous. No matter how much she gave away out of that pantry to the charging of her chieftain father, there was still more and more in it. It was almost by magic. For example, a man might come to the door and he might say, "I need 2 eggs for my children." And she'd say, "Neil, ain't five-bone, there is no problem with that." And she'd go and she'd take 2 eggs from the pantry and give it to him gladly. 2 minutes later, the door would open and a neighbour would come in and say, "You know, my hens laid more eggs than they had of need of today, so I'm giving you 2 for the 2 you gave me last week." And so it was that her pantry was never empty, and there was a song in the heart of all that met her. They said that the beauty came from the dancing eyes in her face and the fervour in her warm heart. But she had tough times too. And the day came when she was still a young woman, when her father said, "I've made a great match for you, Bridget. There is another chieftain who lives across the fields, and I'm going to marry you off to him." "Indeed, you're not," she said. Her father was full of shock, for she had never had a harsh word and had never disobeyed him. "What do you mean by this?" he said. "Well, I feel I already belong to God," she said. "Is that the way? Well then, you can go to your room and you can think on it. In the meantime, the chieftain is on his way." There's a word in the English language, and it's called glamorous. And I was told by a woman, I collected this lovely piece of information, that it came from the Saint Brigid. Because when she went to her room, she left all of the sorrow come into her face, and her face changed, and she became ugly to what she had been before. Her eyes drooped, her heart was so sad, and when she went to the room, her father said, "Who are you?" He didn't even recognize her. And she said, "I'm your Bridget." And then when the man saw her, he said, "Oh, I couldn't be married to someone like her." And so she was free. But her father was unhappy, and he sent her back to her room, and all her joy came into her face again, and it was said that she put on the glamour and that when she was happy, she was glamorous. That happiness is the best makeup that you can have. But while she prayed in her room for a solution, she could hear her father getting angrier and angrier outside. So she knotted together her little sheets and she threw them out through the window, and she climbed down those sheets until she came to the soft earth outside of their dwelling. Brigid knew that she could never again go home. Can you imagine what that's like? To come from a home where there was 3 good meals, where you had friends all your life, where you even knew the animals, to now take to the road. What faith she had. And she made her way from Louth towards the county of Kildare, the place of the oak. She fashioned for herself a little wooden bowl, and she would take it out from under her cloak, and she would walk along, her eyes downcast and the bowl up. How often have we seen those images in the world of today? And people might put in a little bit of food or a coin, and so it kept her alive. Soon her happy nature came back, and she was able to find herself a place in one of the animal houses of a great farm. And finally, because she was so kind and so happy, she found herself living in that house as a servant. And she would go through the town of Kildare every day, giving away what she did not need. And it was a great example, and others, seeing her happiness and her way of life, wanted to join her. These women thought, this is a way to have a little power in this world. And so the day came when she had 19 sisters and herself. And she said, we need a home. And they said, but who was going to give us a whole home all to ourselves? So she went to the chieftain of that area, and she said, I want a piece of land down by the river next to the big oak. Do you? He said. And how much money will you pay for it? I was hoping that you would do it for the glory of God and for the kindness of this neighbourhood. Get down that road, he said, shouting at her, and off she went. She felt deep in her heart and in her gut that she would have to ask 3 times. So she went back a second time, and she said, is there any chance that you have reconsidered? No chance, and there won't be a chance. Get out of my sight, he said, and sent her down the road once more. This time her sisters entreated her, please, Brigid, we don't want to be drawing attention to ourselves. We don't want him to be angry with us. He is the head of this whole place. Please, Brigid, don't draw attention to us. But she had made up her mind. One more time, she said. One more time I'll ask. And on the 3rd time, he came to the door, exasperated, and said, let me see this oaken tree. And he thought that he might give her a little square of land underneath it where she could put a statue. Sure, it would be no harm to have prayers said on his land. But when he followed her down, and he said to her, take off your cloak, Brigid, and whatever ground that cloak can cover, that is the ground that you shall have. Is that a bargain? She said. It is, he said. She said, and put out her hand, and they shook on it. Then she took off her small little cloak, for Brigid was a small, warm little woman, and she put it down on the ground. And then she called 3 of her sisters, and 3 of her sisters came and took a corner of the cloth each. They began to walk in different directions, away from one another, and the cloak grew, brath breda. It grew and grew until there was enough room for a little school, a place to house the sisters, and a place for a little chapel. That chapel still exists to this day if you ever care to come to County Kildare and see it. And that is the legend of St. Brigid and her beautiful cloak. But there were many other legends too, legends of her generosity. despite what her father would say, she would feed the poor. And one day he decided that he wanted to have beef stew. Aren't we all well able to know what the beef stew of Ireland is? She cut the carrots and the onions and the turnip into it, and the meat was softening, and the smell was going out through the window and calling all hungry bellies to it. An old man arrived at the door. He could barely walk. "Céad míle fáilte," she said, 100,000 welcomes, for that is what you said to people when they came to your door in Ireland long ago. And she opened the door wide, and she sat him next to the fire, and she gave him some warm water for his feet that he might wash them, and he sighed happily. And she took the meat that was meant for her father, and she heaped it up into a bowl, and she gave it to this man. He ate it and thanked her, and something in his blue, deep eyes let her know that he was the Christ figure. And when he was gone, she felt so happy with herself, until she heard her father's call. "Oh no," she said, and she took the lid off the pot to see would there be any scraps of meat inside that she might put in his bowl. And there was the same amount of meat as had ever been there before. It was the unending pot. And so when people were hungry, they prayed to Saint Brigid. And in the old days, they would leave a Saint Brigid's table at the gable end of their house, and on it they would put any spare food that they had, so that travellers passing, on Saint Brigid's Day at least, would not leave with a hungry belly from any place, lest they bring down the wrath of Saint Brigid. Isn't that a lovely story? My final Saint Brigid story for tonight, but it's not the final Saint Brigid story in my bag, is the story of the fire of Saint Brigid. Tinna Brida, Saint Brigid's fire. It was said long ago that there was a mountain near Kildare, and on this mountain there was a sacred fire, sacred to the Druid people, and that it was never ever allowed to go out. It was said that there was 7 virgins minding this fire, and that if any man drew near, that he would lose a limb, so all stayed far from this fire. The fire was waning around the time that Brigid came, but she saw it and recognised it for the light of the new year and the light of the fervour of the new religion. So she made her way up that hill, and she took from that fire a burning coal that she brought down to the village of Kildare. She set a fire then, and she asked her sisters to mind it. Fires were very important before matches had been discovered. If you let your fire go out, it meant that you had no warm water and you had nothing to cook on. So it was very important to tend the fire and to give a loan of that fire to any traveller that might pass. If they asked for a light from the fire, they were sure to be given it. Brigid said to her sisters, "We need to mind this fire. It is a symbol, the symbol of the new religion, of Christianity." And she said, "We need to make sure that it always stays lit and always stays strong." And so each sister had their day, and Saint Brigid had the last day. On the 20th day, Saint Brigid would keep that fire going. And the years passed, and Saint Brigid got older and older. And one night she knew that soon she would be going to her reward, to her Maker. And so she called in her first sister and said, "Will you mind the fire?" "But Brigid, it's your night," she said. "I'm asking you, will you tend the fire?" "I will, Brigid," she said. "Be quiet in yourself now." And then she said, "Send in the next sister." And so she asked them all the same question until it came to the 19th sister, who felt a really cranky having been called from her bed because she had tended the fire the night before. all through the night, all through the cold, on the last day of winter, on the 31st of January. And now they were going into spring, and she was being called to ask if she should tend the fire. St. Brigid said, "I'm too tired tonight. Will you tend it for me?" And the question changed. And the sister said, "I will." And she went out, and with bad grace, she was throwing fuel on the fire until she came to a decision. "Brigid, it's your turn to tend the fire," she said, "and if it goes out, it'll be your fault." And off she went to bed. That night was the night that St. Brigid died. And the following day, this sister, consumed with guilt, ran out for sure to think that the fire was going to be out and dead. But she saw that it was as strong as ever, and that someone had put fuel on the fire. She asked the other 18 sisters, and they all said, "In the name of God, it wasn't me." So who was it? Was it the spirit of St. Brigid? That fire kept going, kept lit, all up to the 16th century. But then we had visitors from another land, and unfortunately the chapel was sacked and the fire was put out. In the year 2006, our president then, Mary McAleese, and the head of the Brigidine sisters relit that fire, and it still lights in Kildare, Kildara, the place of Brigid, to this day. Lá féile bríde maithagulh go léir, that you may have a beautiful St. Brigid's Day, because spring has sprung this day and the light is on the way back, and we'll see you soon in Listowel for an old session, or Bandon, or on the Story Road, and soon I'll be bringing these stories to Marrakesh.